The Middle Ages, a time of knights, castles, plagues, and people getting absolutely wrecked. Spanning roughly the 5th to the 15th centuries, this 1,000-year stretch of history gave humanity plenty of time to experiment with new ways to get high. From Chinese scholars tripping on mushrooms in the name of immortality, to 13th century debates over weed legalization, and even witches getting lit at the devil's sacrament. We'll be revealing them all on today's episode of The Infographic Show, How Humans Got High in the Middle Ages. Number 9. Ancient China, High Dynasty. While hallucinogens are mostly used for recreation today, in the ancient world they were often taken for religious and spiritual purposes. In ancient China, shamans known as the Wu were both healers and spiritual leaders, regularly using what they called spirit mushrooms to commune with their deities. However, specifics about how these drugs were used are hard to find in some cases. By the Warring States period, between about 475 and 221 BC, the ancient shamanic practices of the Wu were banned as China shifted to Taoism and Buddhism. But much like what happened with the rise of Christianity in Europe, many ancient spiritual traditions didn't just vanish, they adapted, rebranding themselves to fit in with their new religious landscape. Starting in the Han Dynasty in 206 BC to 220 AD, we find evidence of Taoist adepts experimenting with hallucinogenic plants in their quest to transcend the mortal world. The first-century text biographies of transcendence even details 29 spiritual herbs said to grant immortality, many of which had hallucinogenic properties. Much of what we know about drug use in Imperial China, from the Han Dynasty through the Middle Ages, comes from the literature, art, and religious texts of the time. One recurring motif is that of transcendent immortals, or xian, depicted soaring on clouds or riding dragons. While historians might call it divine symbolism, if you see a guy floating through the sky on a dragon, there's a good chance he's not just spiritually enlightened, he is absolutely tripping. In the 3rd century Taoist classic Master Who Embraces Simplicity, author Ji Hong details various strains of spirit mushrooms that supposedly let users ride on clouds, see heaven, and communicate with the afterlife. He describes one of those strains, the black cloud spirit mushroom, as follows. It grows among black boulders on the shaded side of famous mountains. Consumed after they are dried in the shade, they will enable the body to live for 1,000 years without aging, ride on clouds, communicate with heaven, and see ghosts and spirits. Other sections of the text also mention toads, yes, the kind you can lick, as part of another immortality recipe. But the Taoist psychonauts of ancient China didn't stop at mushrooms and toads. Medieval Chinese encyclopedias describe the psychoactive effects of cannabis flower, wolfsbane, datura, climbing juniper, rhododendron, and even pine nuts. Many of these herbs and plants are still used today as part of spiritual practices among many ethnic groups in Central and Eastern Asia, including the Oroken people of Mongolia and the Evenki people of Siberia. Have you ever had a great video idea but you didn't know how to get started? You're not alone. So many people reach out to me wanting to know how to make a great video they'd be proud to share with friends, family, or even the whole internet. And I finally have an easy answer for them. Invideo AI. Just type in your idea, whether it's a recipe, a commercial, or a movie trailer, and watch as it instantly transforms into a complete video. You can even make changes using simple text commands like add my voice or make the video more engaging. It's intuitive, seamless, and seriously game-changing. Unlike traditional video tools that are complicated and only solve part of the problem, Invideo AI is your creative partner, doing all the heavy lifting while you stay focused on your vision.
Here, the coral reefs burst with vibrancy, illuminated by the sun's gentle rays. Among the coral branches, tropical fish dance in a mesmerizing display of colors and patterns.
It removes friction and puts you in the driver's seat, giving you the freedom to bring your ideas to life without stress. You can try Invideo AI for free. This will save you hundreds of dollars that you would otherwise spend on editing, animating, and other production costs. So click the link and start creating your dream videos today. Number 8. Plant-based high. In the West, many people think of Islamic culture as strict and full of rigid social rules. So it might come as a surprise that during the Middle Ages, parts of the Arab world were actually pretty chill about cannabis. Some accounts say Sufi mystics brought the plant from Asia, and in the 13th century, it was thriving in Egypt, where it was used to make hashish, a hallucinogen that became wildly popular. Medieval Egyptians had plenty of their own nicknames for hashish, calling it everything from shrub of emotion to peace of mind and branch of bliss. But most commonly, it was simply known as the herb. and much like today, the herb was enjoyed in a variety of ways. It could be smoked, baked into a paste, taken in pill form, or toasted and combined with sugar and sesame to make a sort of chewy proto-pot brownie. In 13th century Egypt, hashish was sold openly and legally in markets, making it a staple at private social gatherings and communal bathhouses. Because nothing says relaxation quite like a steam, some snacks, and a little something to take the edge off. Also, a lot like today, the legality of hashish was a hot-button issue among community leaders of the time. The pro-hash contingent cited the herb's many benefits, including enhancing mood, helping you fall asleep, making boring conversation sound more interesting, and crucially, making music sound better. The 13th century writer Al-Ukbari had this to say on the topic: "Only intelligent and well-to-do people use hashish. When taking it, a person should consume only the lightest of foods and the noblest of sweets. He should sit in the most pleasant of places and bring around the most distinguished of friends." Another contemporary account argued, hashish, clothes the dull person with frivolous wit so that he becomes smart and a good companion, in contrast to wine, which is nasty in its effects and causes fear of being unexpectedly caught by authorities. If you go onto any online forum dedicated to stoner culture, you'll probably see these exact same arguments being used to this day, although probably worded less eloquently. But where there is pro-weed sentiment, there is always anti-weed sentiment. Even in the Middle Ages, cannabis had its critics, with medieval doctors acknowledging some of the health benefits, and they also documented its downsides. The 14th century physician Az-Zarkashi compiled a laundry list of hashish's negative effects, including bad breath, cavities, reduced fertility, hair loss, lung damage, and decreased mental sharpness. He even blamed it for reduced modesty and diminished powers of the soul, which, to be fair, might just be old-timey doctor speak for getting too high and making bad decisions. Some sultans were lenient on hashish, others implemented severe penalties for being caught with the herb in your possession, like dental extraction or even death. Others fell somewhere in the middle. During an outbreak of the plague in 1419, one local market merely restricted hash consumption in public spaces. Even by the 15th century, as more lawmakers in Egypt developed a less favorable view on the herb, legislating its use and distribution was an uphill battle. This was especially because Muslim scholars were pretty split on exactly how to view hashish. Some argued that because it had intoxicating effects similar to alcohol, it should not be considered permissible. Others argued that since the Quran never mentions cannabis or any of its derivatives, it could not be strictly outlawed. The discourse around cannabis use in medieval Egypt even got into some extremely granular topics, like whether or not a man could divorce his wife while under the influence of hash, or if it was permissible to give hash to animals. Now let's circle back to Europe. Number 7. The Drunk Ages. Most of the recreational drugs popular in the West today, like cannabis, heroin, and cocaine, weren't yet available to Europeans in the Middle Ages. So, despite what the bizarre human-headed cats and giant snails in medieval manuscripts might suggest, those 12th century friars weren't actually getting high. People just had way stronger imaginations before TV was invented. However, what the people of medieval Europe were consuming, and consuming a lot of, was alcohol. And you might be getting ready to complain that you can't get high from ale or mead, but bear with us for a second. Alcohol back then was a different beast altogether. Today, beer is usually flavored with hops, the flowers of the Humulus lupulus plant, a type of hemp native to Europe, Asia, and North America. Hops have long been used in herbal medicine as a sleep aid and anxiety treatment, but unlike their cousin, the cannabis flower, they won't send you on a psychedelic journey just to bed a little earlier. Hops have a long history of being used to flavor beer in Bohemia and Bavaria, but in other regions of Western Europe, beer was flavored with all sorts of herbs and spices, some of which gave the drink a stronger psychoactive effect. In medieval Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands, beer wasn't just about the hops, it was supercharged with a spice blend called gruit. This mix could include juniper berries, rhododendron, sweet gale, wormwood, mugwort, nutmeg, and even hensbane, all of which have documented psychoactive effects, some of which were even toxic in large doses, meaning that medieval beer could get you buzzed in more ways than one, or send you on a trip you did not sign up for. Basically, depending on where you got it, a medieval European beer was essentially a low-key, old-timey speedball. Number 6. Opium, the original medieval sleep mode. One of the few illicit drugs available to medieval Europeans in a form we would still recognize today was opium. Derived from the Papaver somniferum poppy, which grows across Europe, Asia, and parts of North Africa, opium is packed with potent compounds: morphine, codeine, and thebaine. These chemicals provide powerful pain relief and are still used today to synthesize some of the strongest medical painkillers. Opium has been used by several cultures as a sedative and a painkiller since as far back as 5000 BC. Its first recorded use was by the ancient Greeks, who gave it the name we still use for it in English. Around the 7th century, opium reached India and East Asia through the Persian trade routes. The Middle Ages saw monumental scientific advancements across the Arab world, so it is no surprise that medieval Muslim doctors found all kinds of new uses for opium. In the 10th century, Persian physician Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi published In the Absence of a Physician, a guide to at-home medical treatments where he recommended opium as a remedy for melancholy. Meanwhile, Abu al-Qasim al-Zahrawi, one of the era's most renowned surgeons and a pioneer in eye surgery, used a potent anesthetic blend of opium and mandrake, another psychoactive plant we'll get to later. Al-Zahrawi's work was so influential that his techniques were still in use well into the 16th century. Doctors were still using blends of opium and mandrake for surgical anesthetic up to the Edwardian era. This mixture wasn't without its downsides, though. The Jewish physician Shabbatai Donolo noted in his own writing that mixing opium with mandrake for medicinal use has a high risk of putting the patient in a manic state. Even so, most people in the Middle Ages still thought of opium as a wonder drug that could cure anything, especially after the widespread introduction of its liquid form, laudanum. The invention of laudanum is usually credited to the 16th century Swiss physician Paracelsus. Paracelsus was born Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim in 1493 and is often called the father of toxicology. While Paracelsus wasn't the first person to experiment with alcohol and opium, his mixture was particularly useful for treating pain. His recipe for laudanum included crushed pearls, musk, amber, and other secret herbs and spices. Of his miraculous discovery, he had this to say: "I possess a secret remedy which I call laudanum, and which is superior to all other heroic remedies." But even though Paracelsus invented laudanum, it didn't really catch on until an English doctor named Thomas Sydenham patented his own proprietary version in 1660. Number 5. High times in the Dark Ages. There were also uses for psychoactive substances in Europe folk magic traditions. In the paper Legal Highs in Romania, Historical and Present Facts, the authors cite a number of sources that describe mandrake as a particularly magical and inspirational plant. This mythical reputation is largely due to its hallucinogenic effects and the fact that its roots are shaped a little bit like the human body. Mandrake was used in Romanian folk medicine as an aphrodisiac, an anesthetic, and to treat depression and anxiety. But it was noted that overdose could cause a state of ecstatic frenzy. Curiously, the name mandrake is actually used to refer to a few different plants in this era. To medieval Europeans, mandrake was more of an umbrella term than a single plant. It covered a whole range of psychoactive herbs, including monk's hood, henbane, bay laurel, valerian root, angel's trumpet, and datura. The reason these plants were all grouped together in medieval medicine, they share a key ingredient, scopolamine, a powerful chemical with mind-altering effects. Another scopolamine-rich plant was Atropa belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, a deliriant that saw frequent use in folk medicine. But beyond its medicinal and, let's be honest, probably trippy effects, belladonna had a surprising cosmetic application. The name itself means beautiful woman in Italian, because up until the Renaissance, European women used belladonna eye drops to dilate their pupils, making their eyes look bigger and more alluring. It was like a medieval Instagram filter, but with a much higher chance of poisoning yourself. Paracelsus had a unique take on dangerous chemicals, one that still holds up today. His most famous quote on the subject is, "Poison isn't everything, and no thing is without poison. The dosage makes it either a poison or a remedy." Number 4. Stirring the cauldron and the vibes. Outside of folk remedies, there was another, darker side to drug use in the Middle Ages: witchcraft. If you know anything about the Salem witch trials, you've probably heard the theory that some of these so-called witchcraft cases were actually caused by ergot, a toxic fungus that can grow on wheat. When consumed, ergot poisoning can trigger convulsions, gangrene-like skin damage, and delirium. It's also a powerful hallucinogenic, owing to the fact that it contains naturally occurring lysergic acids, which are what the L and S stands for in LSD. So while the idea that the people of Salem were just tripping out without realizing it might sound like a compelling theory in principle, historians argue that it's not a likely explanation. That's because even back in the Middle Ages, ergot poisoning wasn't treated as some mysterious unexplained phenomenon. The condition, known to medieval Europeans as St. Anthony's fire, was well documented and its fungal cause was reasonably well understood. Despite ergot's hallucinatory and potentially deadly side effects, it was commonly used in herbal medicine as far back as the 1500s. In small doses, ergot's convulsive effects made it an effective way for midwives to induce labor, terminate unwanted pregnancies, and control postpartum hemorrhage in their patients. Ergot is still used in modern medicine today, though in a much more controlled way. In fact, most modern cases of ergotism doesn't come from moldy bread, but from patients accidentally overdosing on migraine medications that use ergotamine as the active ingredient. So if accidental drugging made some people believe that they were the victims of witchcraft, there is plenty of evidence suggesting that the so-called witches themselves were taking drugs to fuel their dark magic. Multiple surviving records from European witch trials mention a mysterious substance known by many names: flying ointment, werewolf ointment, green ointment, or magic salve. And while that might sound like something out of a fairy tale, the ingredients suggest it was less about casting spells and more about getting seriously high. According to Francis Bacon, it was made using flour, wolfsbane, potentilla, the rendered fat of a dead child, and apparently celery juice. Other sources say it could be made with mandrake, hensbane, datura, belladonna, hemlock, or basically any other plant that contains scopolamine. The ointment was applied topically and produced vivid hallucinations and out-of-body experiences for the user. One eyewitness, a doctor named Augustus de Tura of Bergamo, told the priest about a time when he was a young man and had witnessed a witch using flight ointment. While studying medicine in Pavia, Augustus came back to his lodgings late at night to find a maidservant lying on the floor in a comatose state. When he asked her about it the next day, she only said that she had been on a journey. Other eyewitness accounts of supposed witches under the influence of flight ointment describe them being entirely or partially naked, which makes sense given the way in which the flight ointment was taken. When applied as an ointment, psychoactive chemicals can be absorbed through the skin, but are more effective when absorbed through mucous membranes. According to the confessions of multiple witches, the typical method of taking flight ointment was via a greased staff applied to their genitalia. That really gives a new meaning to the idea of riding a broomstick. Number 3. Peyote, because reality is overrated. When Puritans colonized America in the 1600s, their folk magic and witchcraft, including flight ointment, went with them. But before the first witch was ever hanged in America, the religious traditions of the New World also involved using psychoactive substances to transcend consciousness. Unfortunately, though, we can't get as deep into specifics about what drugs people were doing, or really what anyone was doing in America between the 5th and the 15th centuries. Many native cultures in both North and South America have rich oral traditions, but when large numbers of a community died, whether from territorial battles or devastating outbreaks of foreign diseases like smallpox, valuable knowledge was often lost to time. Fortunately, archaeological evidence, along with the writings of a few European colonists, gives us a solid glimpse into how medieval Americans were getting high. In the American Southwest, the Huichol, Tonkawa, Mescalero, and Lipan Apache pioneered the ceremonial use of peyote. This spread to tribes further north like the Comanche and the Kiowa people over several thousand years. Peyote is a slow-growing form of spineless cactus that contains the psychoactive chemical mescaline. Traditionally, the crown or the button, that is, the part of the plant that grows above the ground, will be harvested and dried for ceremonial use. Once dry, the peyote buttons can either be chewed or brewed as a tea in order to release the mescaline. Peyote hallucinations last for about 10 to 12 hours, and they're reported to cause a synesthesia-like effect as well as a feeling of deep spiritual insights. Archaeological evidence of peyote consumption has been found in Native American cultural sites that were dated to be at least 5,500 years old. Peyote remains a key element in the ceremonial practices of Native American religions today. Number 2. Ayahuasca. 4,000 years of whoa. Further south, the people of Bolivia, Peru, and the Amazon rainforest have long used ayahuasca, a powerful psychedelic brew with deep roots in shamanistic traditions and folk medicine. Its history dates back to at least 2000 BC. Drug paraphernalia like snuffing trays, spatulas, and storage pots have been found in many pre-Columbian archaeological sites in the area. Ayahuasca is prepared using the vines of the Banisteriopsis caapi plant, which are harvested, washed, prayed over, and then ground into a paste with wooden mallets. The mashed vines are then boiled, sometimes along with a mix of other psychedelic plants native to the region. There's no set recipe for ayahuasca, and in fact sometimes it doesn't contain any psychoactive plants at all, and it might be instead made with tobacco. The exact mix will vary from shaman to shaman, as well as on the intent of the ceremony. In some South American cultures, it is strictly saved for serious religious rites, but in others, it's just as common to take socially or as a form of group meditation. Either way, the brewing process can take up to a day and results in an extremely concentrated liquid that is then ready to consume. In the 17th century, Vicente de Valverde described the process of a religious ayahuasca ceremony as follows. They set aside an entire night for divination. They prepare a brew from bitter vines or herbs, which when boiled sufficiently must become quite potent. Number 1. Australia's original pick-me-up. The native people of Australia as well have a tradition of using hallucinogens. In the Channel Country region of Queensland, the locals harvested a plant called the Pituri thorn apple, which they would dry and mix with wood ash to create a drug called Pituri. Pituri was used for just about everything, and the fact that it only occurred naturally in one specific part of the country made it extremely valuable for trading with other tribes from all over the continent. Pituri was most commonly rolled into a stick and sucked on to boost mood and stave off exhaustion during long journeys. It could also be burned like incense during surgical procedures, with the smoke having an anesthetic effect on the patient. And like peyote and ayahuasca, it also had hallucinogenic properties. Tribal elders would use it to inspire prophetic visions and communicate with spirits. But it was also consumed recreationally, as it could be fermented overnight in water to make Pituri liquor. Pituri was so common in pre-colonial Australia that it even factored into hunting tactics. Hunters would sometimes dam off a section of a watering hole and spike the water with Pituri, so that any animals that drank from it would become disoriented and easier to catch. Despite its many wonderful uses though, Pituri never really caught on with white Australians. Who knows though, maybe someday it'll make a comeback. From flying ointments to psychedelic beer, medieval people had some wild ways to get high. Which one shocked you the most? And do you think any of these would still hold up today? Drop your thoughts below. Now check out why the Dark Ages were the worst time to be alive, and what medieval junk food was actually like.